everyone, and welcome back to a new video. In today's video, I wanted to share a list of classic writers that I want to read. They are classic authors on my TBR, and I am prioritizing them. They're authors I would like to read in the next few years. You all know that I love classics, and it's been such a wonderful journey the last few years discovering new authors that I've just fallen in love with, and there's no turning back. I love classic literature so much, and I have been reading a lot of classic literature published in the 19th century, a lot in the Victorian era. It's probably my favorite time period to read from, as well as the Regency era and the early 20th century. So a lot of books that I've read that are classics were published within, I would say, 120 years, but I do really want to broaden that. I want to read from authors that wrote and lived many, many years in the past, and I have read some Shakespeare. I've read some fiction from the 18th century, and I've dipped my toes into some older literature, but in general, I find I haven't read a whole variety of classics. I've read mainly books published by Victorian writers, and I definitely want that to change. Something that I've been inspired to do is kind of my own little journey through literature, and I know that there are people doing like a DIY literature degree, people who have not gotten literature degrees and they're just really interested in literature and want to learn more, and they're kind of doing their own thing, and I was really inspired by that. And there's one person in particular who I found a lot of inspiration from, and that is Benjamin McAvoy, and I'll have his channel linked below. He does have a website, and there's a web page that I will also have linked below that kind of gives you an outline of how to get your own Oxford literature degree without paying a dime. It's really just a way to become more well-read and just kind of a way to see how an Oxford literature degree, English degree is structured, and how you can go about, you know, reading the books that you would read in that kind of a program and that kind of thing. And so I've just found a lot of inspiration from him and a bunch of other people as well. And I've written down a list of writers, and we have Old English writers, medieval, the Renaissance and Restoration period, the Romantic writers, and Victorian, and then some modern as well. And I have to say, for the Victorian writers, all credit goes to Katie from Books and Things. She did multiple videos listing off the Victorian writers from A to Z, and it was so in-depth, and I learned so much, and I wrote down all the authors' names. And so I have more than 200 writers that I want to read from, and not just English writers. I mean, like, the list goes on, and there are a lot. But I also have a list of some American writers that I want to try, and ancient writers like Homer and Sophocles and Euripides. I have some Italian writers, French, German, etc. And so over the number of years that the Lord grants me on this earth, I want to deepen my understanding of literature and just become more well-read. It's something I am really passionate about, and like I said, I have a list of over 200 authors from the ancients to modern day that, God willing, I have my whole life ahead of me to read from, to try. I want to read Beowulf. I want to read some of the ancient Roman and Greek writers as well. But with such a long list of writers and philosophers and poets, etc., with such a long list comes a feeling of, this is a lot. I'm overwhelmed. There is no way that in the next few years I'm going to get to all of these authors. So what I've done for this video is made a list of authors that I really, really want to prioritize in the next couple of years. They are authors that I have not read from. So you will not see authors on this list that are, you know, authors like Dickens, Trollope, Gaskell. You won't see Anne Radcliffe, Shakespeare, etc., just because I have already read at least one of their works. And so these are authors I have read absolutely nothing from, but I really want to. And some of these authors, I own books by them. I own some of their works. So that's kind of another reason why they are being prioritized. This list was a lot longer, but I got it down to 15 writers, and I'm going to go through all of them in rough order chronologically. So from the oldest writer to the most modern, which isn't very modern. I think he wrote in the early 20th century. So we're just gonna dive right in. That was a very, very long, rambly intro, but all that was to say, I just want to dive deeper into classic literature more than I already have. I am just finding that I'm loving it more and more, and I'm finding that I need more literature in my life that makes me think and makes me feel a stronger connection to my humanity, and just, I love what classic literature has done in my life, and it is just wonderful. So I'm very excited to share this list, and I would also love to know if you have a list of authors that you have not tried. Who would you say is like your top 5, your top classic writers that you really, really want to try? The list does have some writers of prose fiction, as well as some poets and some playwrights as well. And I've divided the list into 3 kind of broad sections. So we have ancients to medieval / the end of the 15th century. The second section is Renaissance, Restoration, and Romantic period. So that's from 1500 to roughly 1800. And then the last little section is 19th century to modern day. I will do my absolute best to go through these authors very, very quickly. So we're going to start off with the first one, which is Homer. And Homer was a Greek poet born in the 8th century BC, and he is credited with writing both the Iliad and the Odyssey, two epic poems, and the Iliad must be read this year. I have talked about it multiple times now, and I need to read it. I have not yet read it, I have not yet started it, but it is a priority, and I need to read this epic poem. Homer is an icon for a reason, and I just need to bite the bullet and pick this up. And I've heard wonderful things about the translator, Emily Wilson, so although I am nervous, I am also very much looking forward to it. The second writer is Dante Alighieri, and he was an Italian poet, writer, and philosopher, and he wrote the Divine Comedy. It was published around 1320, and it is a narrative poem informed by a profound belief in the dignity and compassion of humanity and influenced by the turbulent society of 13th century Italy. Dante's Commedia is one of the most extraordinary visions of sin and redemption in literature. A work of boundless invention and vast intellectual synthesis, it broke new ground with the vigor of its language and storytelling. The three parts of the Commedia chart the spiritual and physical journey of Dante. In the Inferno, he descends into a freezing hell with the Roman Virgil as his guide. In Purgatorio, he climbs Mount Purgatorio and is reunited with his last love, Beatrice. And finally, in Paradiso, he ascends to heaven and a sphere beyond time and space. The Divine Comedy is well beloved, and it's also been referenced in more modern literature, and I need to read it. So that is the second writer, Dante Alighieri. Dante did write some other poetry as well, so I'm curious to see kind of what he wrote and what they're about, but the Divine Comedy is definitely at the very top of my list. And the final author within this category is Geoffrey Chaucer, and he lived from the mid-14th century up until 1400, and he was an English writer who is well known for the Canterbury Tales. The Canterbury Tales is such a special piece of literature within the English language, within the English culture. It says, beyond all doubt, the greatest work of English literature before Shakespeare, Chaucer's Canterbury Tales brings together an unforgettable group of pilgrims on their way to Canterbury. Pilgrims who came from all ranks of society, from the crusading knight and burly miller to the worldly monk and the famously lusty wife of Bath. Their tales are as various as the tellers, including romance, bawdy comedy, beast fable, learned debate, parable, and Eastern adventure. The resulting collection gives us a set of characters so vivid that they've often been taken as portraits from real life, and a series of stories as hilarious in their comedy as they are affecting in their tragedy. Even after 600 years, their account of the human condition is fresh and true. The Canterbury Tales is not the only poem that Chaucer wrote. He also wrote one called Troilus and Cressida, or Cressida. I'm not sure how to pronounce it, but I believe Shakespeare based his play Troilus and Cressida either on this story or the story that this poem was also based on, and it is set against the backdrop of the Battle of Troy, so it's another one that I'm interested in. And he wrote a whole lot of other poetry, so we'll see after I read the Canterbury Tales. I may try something else by him as well, but I'm very curious. Moving on to the Renaissance, Restoration, Romantic period in rough order here. We're going to start off with John Milton, and he is a writer who has absolutely changed literature with his work Paradise Lost, and this was published in 1667. John Milton's Paradise Lost is one of the greatest epic poems in the English language. It tells the story of the fall of man, a tale of immense drama and excitement, of rebellion and treachery, of innocence pitted against corruption, in which God and Satan fight a bitter battle for control of mankind's destiny. The struggle rages across three worlds, heaven, hell, and earth, as Satan and his band of rebel angels plot their revenge against God. At the center of the conflict are Adam and Eve, who are motivated by all too human temptations, but whose ultimate downfall is unyielding love. I will say I'm a little intimidated by this book, but I do need to read John Milton. I need to experience this incredible piece of epic poetry that he's written. It's a must. I'm especially intrigued by Paradise Lost just because of the time that it was written. It was written during a time of huge religious upheaval and change, and many have considered it one of the greatest poems ever written. So very, very, very curious. I also did want to mention Paradise Lost. It is the main work that he's known for, his magnum opus, but he has written, I believe, a sequel, Paradise Regained. I believe he's also written a number of other poems as well as some works of debate kind of thing. They are considered his prose works, but they have a lot to do with the issues of his time. He was a polemicist, and they basically engaged in really controversial debates. So that's just an interesting fact about John Milton. But Paradise Lost is his main work that I want to read, and then we'll see if I read anything else by him, but very, very intrigued. And then we have Samuel Richardson, and he wrote mainly in the mid 18th century, and he's given a lot of credit basically for making the novel a form of literature, of telling a story in England. Now with Samuel Richardson, I'm not sure which of his works I want to read first. I know a bunch of people just read Pamela in January, and it was very interesting to see people's reactions to it, and it seems to have been the general consensus that it's a really, really silly story, but I'm curious. Pamela is a work that was written in the 1740s, and he also wrote Clarissa. The official title is Clarissa, or the History of a Young Lady, and it comes in at a whopping 1,500 pages. Pamela deals with marriage, and Clarissa, it says, it is a tale that tells the tragic story of a young woman named Clarissa whose quest for virtue is continually thwarted by her family. And I don't want to know too much going into classics in general, so I don't want to read the full summaries of these books, but I'm curious. And he's also well known for his work, The History of Sir Charles Grandison. This is a little interesting tidbit, but it says the History of Sir Charles Grandison was a response to Henry Fielding's The History of Tom Jones, a foundling, which parodied the morals presented in Richardson's previous novels. I actually own The History of Tom Jones by Henry Fielding. I did not add Henry Fielding to this list, but I do own that book, so I'm curious about it. And I believe in this story, a woman is kidnapped and then rescued by Sir Charles Grandison, and the story goes from there. I had to include this author on this list just because of the impact he's had on the novel and the way that we tell stories in the English language, and I just think it's fascinating, so I'm very curious. I just don't know which of his works to try first. Besides those three works, I believe the only other novel he wrote was Pamela in Her Exalted Condition, which is a sequel to Pamela, and that's basically it for novels. But I am very, very intrigued by this author and how he kind of ushered in a new way of telling stories, a new movement in literature. I'm very curious about this Samuel Richardson, so he had to be on the list. At number 6, we have Oliver Goldsmith, and he was an Irish-born British writer. He was a poet, dramatist, novelist, and essayist. He wrote, translated, or compiled more than 40 volumes of work. And it says, good sense, moderation, balance, order, and intellectual honesty mark the works for which people remember him. It looks like he wrote some romantic ballads, he wrote some nonfiction, but he is most well known for The Vicar of Wakefield, a tale supposed to be written by himself. And this was published in 1766. I really don't want to know too much about this story, but I have heard it's very sweet. I've heard it has some really funny moments as well, and definitely one that I want to read soon. The next author is Sir Walter Scott, and he is one that is also iconic in English literature. And it says he was a Scottish novelist, poet, and historian. His knowledge of history and literary facility equipped him to establish the historical novel genre as an exemplar of European Romanticism. Scott's work shows the influence of the 18th century Enlightenment. He thought of every individual as basically human, regardless of class, religion, politics, or ancestry. A major theme of his work is toleration. His novels express the need for social progress that does not reject the traditions of the past. And I believe the majority, if not all of his works, were published in the Regency period, but they are works of historical fiction. And I am very, very excited to dive into Sir Walter Scott's works. I've read nothing by him, but I do own Ivanhoe, and so this is the first book that I want to try by him. I've heard it has vibes of Robin Hood, and it's set in the medieval period. From what I've heard, I could be totally wrong about that, but it is historical fiction, and I'm just so excited. I don't read a lot of books that give off those, knight in shining armor kind of vibes, and I want to read more. I want to try some, and I'm just so intrigued. And I've owned this book for so long but have yet to pick it up, and I guess it's partly because I'm intimidated, but I just need to try it. I need to try Sir Walter Scott. And this is a book in a very long series that he's written called the Waverley novels. And correct me if I'm wrong, but I do believe that they can be read in any order. I don't think there is an overarching plot to the stories. The first book in the series is called Waverley, and I would eventually like to start from the beginning as well. But this is the first book that I want to try by Sir Walter Scott, and there are a lot of books. He's written a lot of books, so I'm very, very intrigued, very excited. And this one was published in 1819. So Regency era fiction would have been enjoyed by people living in that time. And I just think that's so fun. So Sir Walter Scott had to be on this list. So that is it for the second, I guess, section in terms of time frame. And the rest of the authors are all 18th century and onwards. This one I don't really have in a true chronological order just because a lot of these authors wrote around the same time. So it's general, but the very last author is the most modern, I guess, out of all of them, even though he is definitely not with us anymore. But we're going to start off with Mrs. Margaret Oliphant, and she was a prolific Victorian writer. She wrote so many novels. She was a Scottish novelist and historical writer who usually wrote as Mrs. Oliphant. Her fictional work encompassed domestic realism, the historical novel, and tales of the supernatural. She has written so many novels. I believe there are over 50 here. I don't know the exact number, but she's written a lot. Some short stories and articles in different magazines. She was truly, truly prolific. She is known for the Chronicles of Carlingford, and it is a series. The first couple of stories in the series are short stories, The Executor and the Rector. And then she has The Doctor's Family, Salem Chapel, The Perpetual Curate, Miss Marjorie Banks, and Phoebe Jr. And it's a series, and I've heard wonderful things about this series in particular. But what I would like to try out first out of all her works is Hester. I recently got this and I've heard really, really good things about it. It is a later Victorian novel. It was published in the 1880s. It is also subtitled A Story of Contemporary Life. So I believe it has a lot of domestic realism in it, which I love in Victorian literature. I want to know very, very little going into it, but it says it examines the cycle of history through the lives of the Vernon family. I don't know if it's like a family saga. I really don't know much about it. I've heard it really delves into a discussion on human nature, and there are intergenerational conflict kind of things going on. So Hester is definitely the very first work that I want to try by this author. I'm very, very excited. The next author on my list is Richard Doddridge Blackmore, and he was an English novelist who was more popular in the second half of the 19th century. It says he's often referred to as the last Victorian, and he acted as a pioneer of the new romantic movement in fiction that continued with Robert Louis Stevenson and others. He won acclaim for vivid descriptions and personification of the countryside, similarly to Thomas Hardy, which I find very interesting. And this man has written a lot as well, a lot of novels, but it seems like he's just kind of fallen into the shadows, like so many other Victorian writers. And obviously we have Dickens and Trollope and Gaskell, etc., these authors that we still love to this day, and for very good reason. But there are so many other wonderful writers that are contemporaries of these more well-known authors, and it's like they've just fallen into the shadows. A lot of their works are out of print, and I'm thinking of authors like Charlotte Mary Young, who I've just fallen in love with, and it just blows my mind that none of her books are in print anymore, and that just makes me very, very sad. But with R.D. Blackmore, the one book that is still relatively known to this day is Lorna Doone. This one I have heard amazing things about, but only from a select few people. Not a lot of people that I know have read this book, but those who have loved it. And I do believe this is his only work that is still in print, if it even is, but this is an older edition, I think from the 90s. All I know about this story is it is a romance and adventure story set in the 1600s, so it is historical fiction as well. I have heard to expect beautiful nature writing, and I'm just very, very curious, and I need to read this author. For once, the summary on the back actually doesn't spoil anything, which is nice. But it says, Lorna Doone, A Romance of Exmoor, is a historical novel of high adventure set in the southwest of England during the turbulent time of Monmouth's rebellion in 1685. It's also a moving love story told through the life of the young farmer John Ridd, as he grows to manhood, determined to right the wrongs of his land and to win the heart and hand of the beautiful Lorna Doone. It is quite a chunker, but I am very, very excited to read it. So that is Lorna Doone, and that is R.D. Blackmore, an author I need to read from. This next author, I am still in utter disbelief that I have not read a single book by him. I am cheating just a little bit with him because I do think I've read maybe one or two of his short poems. So it's not that I haven't read a single word by him, so I am cheating a little bit. but I did have to put him on this list. He is an iconic Victorian writer for good reason, and I just need to right the wrong of not having read him yet. And I'm talking about Rudyard Kipling. He was a journalist, short story writer, poet, and novelist. And in 1907, he won the Nobel Prize for Literature. He's known as a major innovator in the art of the short story. His children's books are classics of children's literature, and one critic described his work as exhibiting a versatile and luminous narrative gift. I find it also very interesting how he was born in India and lived throughout the height of the British Empire, and he wrote the Jungle Book. He's very well known for the Jungle Book. I have heard that he kind of had a mixed reputation. People saw him in different ways. He may have had some problematic opinions. I don't know really much about him, but he is an iconic writer for a reason, and I do want to try his works. And I do want to read the Jungle Book, but I am a little more interested in his book titled Kim. I do like the summary for this one. It says, Kimball O'Hara grows up an orphan in the walled city of Lahore, India. Deeply devoted to an old Tibetan Lama, but involved in a secret mission for the British, Kim struggles to weave the strands of his life into a single pattern. Charged with action and suspense, yet profoundly spiritual, Kim vividly expresses the sounds and smells, colors and characters, opulence and squalor of complex, contradictory India under British rule. This one was also published right at the tail end of the Victorian era in 1901, but I am so intrigued. I need to read this book. I'm just pretending the 1 or 2 poems I read by him didn't happen, but he had to be on this list. The next writer on the list is a poet from the Victorian era, and that is Elizabeth Barrett Browning. And I would also say her husband. I didn't include him on this list, but Robert Browning is another poet that I would eventually like to read from. But I do first want to read from Elizabeth Barrett Browning, and in particular her novel Aurora Leigh, or her poem, her novel in verse, I believe it is, Aurora Leigh. But she was a very well-known Victorian poet, one of the most well-known and beloved, as well as her husband. People like Edgar Allan Poe and Emily Dickinson very much admired her works, and she was very popular in England and the United States. She was very religious as well, so a lot of her poems do have Christian themes. But I did mention Aurora Leigh being the novel in verse that I really want to read by her. And all I know is that it is a novel in verse that tells the story of a female writer balancing her work and love life. And apparently it's based on Elizabeth's own experiences. So I'm very curious. I've heard very good things about this poem. I heard it's kind of a coming of age story as well, and I'm very intrigued. So I had to include Elizabeth Barrett Browning. The next few writers I have on this list are all Russian writers, and I do want to read some more Russian literature as well. I have read Leo Tolstoy and some of Dostoevsky, but there are many more Russian writers out there that I would love to give a try. And the first one is Anton Chekhov. He was a playwright and short story writer. I don't know too much about him, but I do find it interesting. It says the British and Irish critics that read his works didn't really find his works pleasing during his lifetime. And I also believe that Lenin was a fan. Very interesting guy. So I'm curious, but I do have this collection here, 5 plays by Anton Chekhov, and he is, I believe, most well known for The Seagull. It's one of his most popular plays, as well as Ivanov, Uncle Vanya, Three Sisters, and The Cherry Orchard. And I don't really know anything about these plays. I do really enjoy plays, and I need to read more. But it says, he involves us in the emotional experience of his characters as they seek for a pattern and meaning in their lives. These 5 plays on which his reputation rests defy attempts to determine what they're actually about. I'm a little nervous now, but I am very curious, and because I love plays, I need to just read more, and I've had this for a long time and still haven't read them, so definitely a priority. Then we also have Ivan Turgenev, and he was a Russian novelist, short story writer. He also wrote poetry and plays, and he was a contemporary of Tolstoy and Dostoevsky as well. It says Turgenev was more concerned with the movement towards social reform in Russia than things like religion. His works offer realistic, affectionate portrayals of the Russian peasantry and penetrating studies of the Russian intelligentsia, who were attempting to move the country into a new age. He was born in the Regency era and died in the 1880s. He is most well known for Fathers and Sons, and that's considered one of the greatest novels of the 19th century, and I do want to read it. But the first book by him that I want to read is called First Love, and it's the book that really captured my interest. It says, set in the world of 19th century Russia's fading aristocracy, Turgenev's story depicts a boy's growth of knowledge and mastery over his own heart as he awakens to the complex nature of adult love. I've heard wonderful things about this book, and it's also very short, and I feel like with Russian literature, I tend to get very intimidated, so I feel like starting with a shorter one by him would probably be good for me. But he did write many more novels and short stories, and we'll see kind of what I think of First Love and then go from there. I probably should have started off with this next writer, as he's considered to be the father or the founder of modern Russian literature, and he was huge during the Romantic period, and he is also considered to be the greatest Russian poet to have lived. And I'm talking about Alexander Pushkin. And I'm probably gonna butcher the pronunciation of the title of this book that he wrote, but I think it's Evgeny Onegin. It looks like Eugene, but I'm pretty sure it's pronounced Evgeny. I could be so wrong. But anyways, this book is a novel in verse, and it's set in the 1820s in Russia, and it says it follows the fates of 3 men and 3 women. Engaging, full of suspense, and varied in tone, it also portrays a large cast of other characters and offers the reader many literary, philosophical, and autobiographical digressions, often in a highly satirical vein. And I've heard nothing but praise for this poem. I've heard it is absolutely incredible. I know multiple people who have read it and absolutely adore it, and I'm so curious. I know he's written a bunch of other poems and plays, and there's one novel of his that caught my attention, and that is The Captain's Daughter. It's actually more of a novella, but it says it's kind of in the style of Walter Scott, and it's a historical novel. So I'm curious about that, as well as The Queen of Spades and Other Stories, and it's a collection of his short stories, of which I've heard great things. So very curious to read from Alexander Pushkin. He had to be on this list. I am very intrigued, but of course, Evgeny Onegin is at the top of my to-be read list. And we have finally made it to the last author on this list, and he is the most modern author, although he was born in the Victorian era, so he's not very modern, but the final author on my list is H.G. Wells. He was born in the mid-19th century and died in the 1940s. And he was very prolific as well. He wrote so many novels, and he's really considered one of the fathers of science fiction. And although science fiction isn't my thing, I'm so intrigued by his main works that he's known for. And I don't know which one I want to read first. So this is where I'll need your help. You let me know which book of his you think I should read first. But I am trying to decide between The Time Machine, and this is a dystopian time travel story where the main character is a Victorian scientist and he propels himself to the year 802-701 AD. Very curious about that. Then we have The Invisible Man, which is about a man that's made himself invisible. Pretty self-explanatory. Then we have The War of the Worlds. There is an army of invading Martians that land in England. And then finally, The Island of Dr. Moreau. And in this one, a shipwrecked gentleman named Edward Prendick, stranded on a Pacific island, lorded over by the notorious Dr. Moreau, confronts dark secrets, strange creatures, and a reason to run for his life. So those are the 4 that I'm kind of trying to decide which one do I want to try first? Which one do I feel I would enjoy the most? And I don't know, because I'm not huge on science fiction, but I need to read this author. He is an iconic author for a reason, and I just need to read his works. I'm honestly really leaning towards The Island of Dr. Moreau, mainly because of a trilogy I read, the Strange Case of the Alchemist's Daughter, or something like that, by Theodora Goss. And one of the characters, all of the characters are actually inspired by classic characters from classic literature, and one of them is the fictional daughter of Dr. Moreau. So I'm really curious. I'm curious to see kind of the origin story. But that is H.G. Wells, and that is the 15th and final author on this list. And I am really looking forward to the next few years, just diving in deeper into classic literature and literature from different cultures as well. It was just so hard narrowing this list down, especially after all the names that I wrote down in my notebook, and there are just so many writers I want to read from, like Robert Southey, Lord Byron, these poets from the Romantic period. There are, I think, around 100 Victorian novelists just from the Victorian period that I haven't read from and want to. This list was as narrow as it gets, but those are the authors that I want to read in the next few years. They're the authors that I'm prioritizing, authors I've read nothing from, but really want to. But friends, thank you so much for sticking around, for watching this video. It means the absolute world to me. And I'd love to know what authors would make it on your list. What are authors that you want to read from, authors you've never read from before, classic writers that you feel like you need to read their works and they're definite priorities for you. I would love to know. But friends, that is it for this video. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in my next one. Bye.